Harry Edwards, Professor Emeritus. Harry was on the faculty right here at Berkeley from 1970, long before most of you were born, to 2001. And he taught Sociology of Sport. He's a pioneer in many of the ideas associated with that. He grew out of his dissertation at Cornell, and he's given a lot of thought and really devoted his life to sort of the interface between academics and athletics and the issues that are associated with that. So he's going to provide some information by way of introduction himself, so I'll turn it over to Harry. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much for having me. As stated, I taught here from 2000 to 2001. I finally decided it was time to go after I walked into class one day. I had these large classes in PSL 1. I used to teach classes in the Wheeler Auditorium over at the Science Building, 600, 700, 800 students. And then one day I walked into a class, and a substantial number of the students in there were my previous students' grandchildren. That's when I knew it was time to go. Anyway, let me start by simply saying that some people come late to this effort, to this discipline. I go back quite a ways. If you go back to a 1968 issue of Sports Illustrated, there was a photo on the far left, appropriately, of me when I was back in my radical days, back in my the days when I was a member of the Black Panther Party, advocating that South Africa and Southern Rhodesia be thrown out of the Olympic Games for racism, that black athletes in this country boycott the Olympics over racism and discrimination, both in athletics in this country, in academia, as well as in the society at large. It made no sense for us to go and run in Mexico and crawl at home. So we were advocating a boycott of the games and demonstrations at the games over the issue of racism and in academics, in sports, and in society. There were no black coaches. There was no Tony Dungy or Mike Tomlin. There was no John Thompson. There was no black individual heading up a athletic program, a major athletic program on any traditionally white campus in this country, including the University of California at Berkeley. Not even as an assistant coach. We had as one of our slogans, we do not believe that we should play where we can't work. And if we can't be a head coach, how are we ever going to be accepted as head of state? There's a direct line of ascendancy between the activities around civil and human rights in sports and the emergence of Barack Obama in the White House, of Hillary Clinton as a legitimate candidate for president. In the after World War II, which seems like ancient history, I'm quite certain to most of you, there was a push for broadening the base of the democratic participation in American society. The soldiers, black soldiers who went overseas, fought what we called a double V battle. Victory over racism abroad and victory over racism at home. And so when the soldiers came home, when America began to go into its non-war footing, there was a tremendous push to broaden the basis of black participation in American society more generally. It was under that auspices that you began to get integration in American sports in combination with some business interest. So you began to get sports integrated professional football first in 1946 with Woody Strode and Kenny Washington at the Los Angeles Rams, largely under auspices of a threatened lawsuit because the Rams used a public facility, namely the Coliseum, and yet blacks were not allowed to play professional football. That was in 1946. Also in 1946, Branch Rickey brought in Jackie Robinson out of the Negro Leagues, also under pressure, and along with some business interests. Major League Baseball, which was the major sport at that time, literally the American pastime, had a major manpower shortage coming out of the war. Yet, the Negro Leagues were filling up stadiums, rented white stadiums, to play Negro League baseball games, and Branch Rickey was businessman enough to understand we could use those Negro dollars, and we most certainly could use those Negro athletes. And they went into the Negro Leagues and they brought out players such as Jackie Robinson, Willie Mays, Hank Aaron, Ernie Banks. I mean, just great Hall of Fame players. It was not so much about brotherhood as it was about politics and business. The political aspects of it were both national and international. You had this double B struggle, which was at the very foundations of a burgeoning civil rights movement, and you had the growing competition between East and West over the hearts and minds of third world resource-rich countries. So the United States was in a battle with the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc countries, and with China, and those countries, Soviet Union and China in particular, used American racism against America in third world resource-rich countries in Africa, Central and South America, and most certainly in Asia. And so the United States moved to integrate. Baseball was a major part of that. It framed those politics framed the integration of sport. Sport, on the other hand, helped to mold and frame the emerging, broadening base of democratic participation in American society. Jackie Robinson was our Gandhi. Long before Martin Luther King in 1956 was nominated to bring forth to lead the Montgomery bus boycott over segregated public accommodations and buses, Jackie Robinson had already shown that nonviolent direct action works. So if you go back and look at those old grainy films of Jackie Robinson playing for the Brooklyn Dodgers, you look in the stands, there were black people in those stands. They heard the epithets. They saw the black cats thrown on the field. They saw the people sliding into second base with their spikes up. They saw the pitchers throwing at Jackie's head. But as Jackie himself states in his autobiography, I never had it made, his last statement on sport and society before he died, if those black people in the stands had blown up over those epithets and so forth, it would have been worse than if I had blown up on the field. If I had blown up on the field, maybe we would have had a melee. If they had blown up in the stands, we'd have had a race riot. And so we had already experienced and participated in nonviolent direct action 10 years before Dr. King ever came on the scene. That was the template for the Civil Rights Movement, which led to the Voting Rights Act, which led to the Civil Rights Act, which led to Barack Obama being in the White House. Title IX of the Civil Rights Act is the Title IX that everybody refers to when they talk about broadening the base of women's participation in sport. In 1972, there were 26 schools that gave scholarships to women athletes. Today, there are 536 directly as a consequence of Title IX, but it came out of the Civil Rights Movement, which is directly related to Jackie Robinson and that whole movement. In 1968, there was another step taken forward in that regard. These athletes in the 1960s were not just concerned about access, like Jackie was. They were concerned about dignity and respect. And so you go back and look at those athletes, and the first thing that becomes clear is that Curt Flood was not Jackie Robinson. Tommy Smith and John Carlos, who demonstrated at Mexico City, were not Jesse Owens. Bill Russell was not Meadowlark Lemon or member of the Harlem Globetrotters. And Muhammad Ali most certainly was not Joe Louis. Those athletes, Jesse, Joe, Jackie, fought for access. These athletes fought for dignity and respect, and to a substantial degree won that battle. That's why we have black coaches now. That's why you have Tony Dungy hoisting the Lombardi Trophy. That's why you have Mike Tomlin hoisting the Lombardi Trophy. They set a template where blacks were accepted based on not just the content of their character, but based on the caliber of their competence. Of course, when you begin to become involved in such activities as that, you draw the ire of certain people, such as J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI. And that was part of my file at that time. But as people look back, of course, they begin to reassess things, and you're no longer an armed subversive looking to overthrow the government. You are a legend, and they begin to write all kinds of books celebrating your contributions and so forth. But essentially, what I was saying here is the same thing that I ultimately said before. As a student, I wrote a number of books, The Revolt of the Black Athlete, when I was a student at Cornell. I also wrote a number of articles going forward in the 1980s, in particular. One that was critically important was in the College Board Review, and what that had to do with was the inevitable problem that collegiate athletics was going to cause the academic integrity of colleges and universities, that there was no way for it to be contained. This, even though it was a cover story in the College Board Review in their spring 1984 issue, people, well, that's Edwards, as the executive director of the NC2A, Walter Byers, said at the time, he's just a big black thorn in the jockstrap of American collegiate sports, and so therefore we can dismiss him. The same with an article that I published in The Atlantic a year earlier, saying that this was a major problem involving the very integrity of academics and our educational institutions. That you cannot have what is going on relative to black athletes in collegiate athletics, big-time collegiate athletics, where they're being recruited, their football, their basketball is being taken away from them, they're being summarily dumped, and nobody's saying anything, nobody is raising the flag of integrity and so forth. Eventually, that has to begin to consume the university itself. That's what this article was about. Then in 1984 as well, I wrote an article entitled The Collegiate Athletic Arms Race. That was in the Journal of Sport and Social Issues. Nobody paid very much attention to it at that time. But in 1987, Ira Heyman, who just passed last week, who at one time was the vice chancellor here, went to the NC2A, and on the floor of the NC2A, he essentially presented this article and said, this is one that we must begin to pay attention to, as was stated in a book called College Sports, Inc. By Murray Sperber. He was roundly, it was met with tremendous levity. He was virtually laughed off of the floor. The reality is that has now, all of this has caught up with us. Back in, someone wrote a book, Richard Hoffer, called Something in the Air. This was looking at the 1968 efforts that we made around college and Olympic athletics, and the push that we made to get African Americans hired as coaches and so forth. Coming out of World War II with Jackie Robinson, there was something in the air. Now, again, I want to say unequivocally that there is something in the air. I want to, from this point, stick very close to my notes here. It's only about 2 pages, and then perhaps we can have some discussion, but I want you to think very clearly about what I'm saying. There have been all kinds of proposals put forth to get college athletics off of the campus, get college athletics out of the academic arena, that there's a clash and a conflict. We're no more going to get college athletics out of colleges and universities then we can take pig out of pork. It's simply not something that is going to happen. Colleges and universities in America can no more have organized physical activities and have them not in some way or guise approximate what we have now in terms of college athletics than a chicken can lay a duck egg. The system is only capable of producing that which it is geared, structured, acculturated to produce. This is not Europe. This is America. And there is a century-plus tradition of college sports being embedded, a free enterprise activity being embedded in colleges, American colleges and universities. The problem is that it has gotten totally and completely out of hand, largely as a consequence of the collegiate athletic arms race. So let me do this short presentation and perhaps we can go from there. By the way, this was a piece that was originally commissioned by the University of California magazine. When they got the piece for the first time in the writer's history with the magazine, it was, as he said, spiked. But the Chronicle of Higher Education very quickly picked it up and said this is something that all of these schools need to consider. Over the last 40 years, my perspectives as a scholar activist on developments at the interface of sport and society have been analytically and strategically informed by what I termed in my Cornell University dissertation in 1969, the first principle of the sociology of sport. Sport inevitably recapitulates the character, structure, and dynamics of human and institutional relationships within society, and the ideological and value sentiments rationalizing and justifying those relationships. This is why you are not going to get sport out of universities. It reflects and recapitulates the system of human and institutional relationships that are generated by and that impinge upon the university itself. It is only within the context of this principle that we can understand what framed and fueled the revolt of the black athlete in the late 1960s that challenged what I then called the plantation structure and operation of big-time collegiate sports, particularly football, basketball, and track. We got into involvement with the Olympics because we found that the NC2A and the United States Olympic Organizing Committee were basically an interlocking directorate. That the same people that you found in the NC2A, you found in the United States Olympic Committee in one capacity or association or another. And so it was clear, especially given the fact that 81% of America's Olympic contingent came out of the colleges and universities, that there was no way that we could deal with the structure and operation of collegiate athletics unless we also dealt with the structure and athletics of the International Olympic Committee. The International Olympic Committee, despite all of the heroism and so forth of black athletes, had never had a black person as part of that committee. Of course, once we pointed that out and attacked them in 1968, they hired their first African-American, appointed their first African-American to the United States Olympic Committee, Jesse Owens, and his first job was to attack us. So this is quite typically the way that things work out. But they did appoint an African American. Though he condemned my characterization of big-time collegiate athletics as a plantation structure and operation at the time, then NC2A Executive Director Walter Byers, over 20 years later, in 1987, 20 years after I had originally characterized these activities as plantation operations, Byers wrote in his memoir that today, and I quote, "Today the NC2A President's Commission is firmly committed to the neo-plantation belief that the enormous proceeds from college games belong to the overseers, administrators, and supervisors, coaches. The plantation workers performing in the arena may only receive those benefits authorized by the overseers." That's almost word for word what I stated in 1967 and was roundly condemned for having the audacity, especially as a scholarship athlete myself, to make that statement. Now, characteristically, the black athletes' revolt of the 1960s was aimed at broadening the scope of black participation in mainstream sports beyond the athlete role to include power, authority, and decision-making positions, athletic director, head coach, assistant coach, public information director, and so forth. As I stated, this was a struggle for dignity and respect. This was a struggle for recognition of our capabilities and contributions, or as Al Campanis once stated, that we had the necessities to be decision makers and to hold down authority positions. Without this struggle, there's no Barack Obama. Without this struggle, there's no Title IX in women's sports, and I don't think that there's a Hillary Clinton without a Billie Jean King to lead that fight. The revolt was both framed and fueled by ideological definitions and action forms characteristic of a burdening, broad-scope social, cultural, and political spin-off of the civil rights movement among black youths, namely the Black Power movement. In both sport and society, the quest for an expression of black power principally challenged established black-white power and authority arrangements. It did not seek to meet the challenge that Byers cited, a restructuring of the system of wealth distribution within collegiate athletics to include the producers of the wealth, the athletes. That is where we have arrived today. In any event, by the time that Mr. Byers conceded the legitimacy of the plantation model, my focus had shifted to what I called in a 1984 article in the Journal of Sport and Social Issues, the collegiate athletic arms race. The issue was no longer simply the plantation power and authority hierarchy, by then interspersed with an increasing, though still not representative, number of blacks in authority positions. The same dynamic at the core of the athletic exploitation of black athletes under the plantation system, the pursuit of rising sports-generated wealth in response to the rising cost of being competitive, had metastasized into an all-out arms race that, as I warned at the time, would become increasingly unmanageable and ultimately unsustainable. As stated, the history of the collegiate athletic arms race in its current guise goes back to the 1960s, and the competition among institutions and conferences for television broadcasts and sponsorship dollars. This is why they were ripping off the athletes. They bring athletes in and use them up and dump them and go get some more. It wasn't about education. And we could not get a single solitary academic senate to say, hey, they are right. This is wrong. And ultimately it has to spread to consume greater and greater resources at greater and greater cost to everybody outside of the athletic hierarchy. This was 1967 that we were making that argument. My reward for making that argument was to be fired from San Jose State, put on the FBI's list of violent subversives and revolutionaries, and essentially denied tenure my first time around here at the University of California at Berkeley, although Ira Heyman did finally step up and say, hey, you know what, this is just political. And they reversed it. But that was part of the cost of simply saying, this is what we're looking at, this is what we're facing. The problems associated with athlete recruitment, all of the stuff that you still read about in papers about athletes taking money from agents and so forth, other kinds of recruitment violations, illegal payments and academic eligibility issues, the separation of institutions into 3 divisions and then Division I into Division 1A and 1AA, the creation of the College Football Association and its breakaway from the NC2A in 1976, the Bowl Coalition and its breakaway from the College Football Association in 1992, the Bowl Alliance in 1995, and the Bowl Championship Series, which we're dealing with today, in 1998, the split between major conferences and mid-major conferences of the Division I pool, the multi-million-dollar head coach contracts and expanding coaching staffs, which went from 6 football coaches, for example, when I was a scholarship athlete, to as many as 22 assistant coaches to a head coach. Today, this expanded coaching staff in football and basketball, the ongoing expansion of conferences to include more institutions to the point of emergent super conferences that ultimately will dominate both the markets and the money associated with collegiate athletics, to the detriment and in an increasing number of cases to the demise of lesser programs and conferences. And most importantly, the grossly expanding athletic budgets, facility debt service obligations, and the resultant financial burdens upon student tuition and fees and general fund resources are all manifestations of what are now generally referred to in NC2A circles as arms race issues. And the pressures are mounting to begin to disarm. For example, on September 28, 2010, the University of California at Berkeley announced that it was reducing its athletic budget, which had required $14 million a year in general fund subsidies, by scrapping 163 athletic scholarships and eliminating 5 sports programs. Even though there's been some adjustments in that regard, the initial problem is still there. Also, the Academic Senate, the faculty governing body of the University of California at Berkeley, passed a non-binding resolution to the effect that the UC Athletic Department should become self-sustaining, a direct reaction to millions being siphoned off from university resources in support of intercollegiate athletics, while the staffs and course offerings of academic departments are suffering escalating budget cuts and freezes. For the most part, neither basketball nor football was significantly impacted by these fiscal adjustments. Unless and until these 2 programs are included in such efforts, there will likely be little change beyond what Walter Byers might have called tightening a few belts on a worn machine. In the FBS conferences, the Football Bowl Series conferences, median spending per student athlete far outstrips spending per student in the general academic populations, ranging from 4 to 11 times as much. Of even more concern is the fiscal trajectory of superconference institutional athletic department budgets, which, according to the watchdog Knight Commission, by the year 2020, top collegiate athletic programs belonging to these superconferences are expected to have overall budgets exceeding $250 million a year. Athletic budgets serving an average of less than 600 students. Against this background, I offer the following. It is my view that institutional dynamics are sufficiently underway and fiscal contradictions sufficiently established to set the stage for systemic change in the economic arrangements of big-time collegiate athletics. First, going forward,
under pressure from faculty and student groups and some outside political interest, athletic departments will be compelled as a consequence of maintaining conference-mandated sports offerings and of remaining fiscally solvent and athletically competitive to increasingly wean themselves from the pressures, constraints, and uncertainties of university resources and garner support from outside corporate sponsors. In other words, we could well be watching the ex-oil corporation California Bears playing the Y Sports Drink Corporation Oregon Ducks with local and state sponsors interspersed during timeouts and breaks. We're already a long way up that road. Phil Knight has spent millions of dollars from Nike on University of Oregon. You go out here and look at every time there's an extra point or a field goal kick, the all-state banner comes up. We're already up that road. And with the pressure and the push from behind, it is going to become increasingly clear that athletics in the collegiate environment are either going to have to collapse, which nobody is going to allow to happen in these big-time programs, or they're going to have to go corporate. Secondly, with substantial trends toward the complete corporatization of big-time collegiate football and basketball in particular, pressures will mount to share the wealth with the athletes who produce the wealth, along with some grant aid support for athletes pegged to the average student cost of living. The more profitable programs will likely be pressed to do more. Right now, the NC2A has given schools the option of trying to fill the gap, that $3,000 to $6,000 gap between what the scholarship pays for and what the actual cost of living is on a campus that the average athlete on grant and aid is confronted with. They have the option now of doing that. That's not enough. That's kicking the can up the road. The reality is, when you kick the can up the road, when you get up the road to where the can isn't the same size. It's bigger. And so that's the problem with kicking the can up the road. This is the same thing. To say in their past, coming out of their past convention, that some schools have the option, if they wish, to pay athletes more based on a cost of living index at that campus is not going to get it done. They're going to have to put a floor on the athletes that allows them to live at the same level as the other students on campus, because the money is being made. This could well lead to allowing student athletes, but they're going to have to do more. And this could be what they have to do. They could have to allow student athletes to sign on with and receive advances, loans, or some other designated financial support from agents who are vetted by, registered with, and subject to the accounting oversight of the NC2A and the particular conferences, universities, and athletic departments involved. The exact character of such arrangements, of course, would need to be worked out. Furthermore, legitimizing agent involvement would bring what is already happening into the sunlight. The NC2A enforces its regulations on a whack-em ball basis. The one that pops up is the one that gets hit, but there are 30 more doing the same thing for everyone that pops up. They don't have the staff, they don't have the resource, they don't have the investigative potential to actually get that, to actually police collegiate athletics. So why not say, okay, you can have an agent, and up to this amount, you're fine. If you go over that amount, then the agent has to pay for the whole 5 years, the scholarship, and everything else. Let the agent take the risk, as opposed to the university. It would also, this legitimizing of agent involvement would also deal with the Title IX issues, because if a Maya Moore could get an agent to advance her $100,000 while she's playing for the University of Connecticut or whatever, then hey, great. But if no one will do that, then that's not the school's obligation. And finally, one precipitating ingredient that is missing from this change-ready mix of arms race physical dynamics and contradictions and faculty-student political pressure is a force that would ideologically frame, fuel, and provide action forms and templates to be emulated by those who stand to be most directly impacted by the physical corporatization of collegiate athletics, the athletes, the 99%ers of big-time sports. If you go back, as I stated, coming out of World War II, there was this push to broaden the base of democratic participation in American society. That movement that became the civil rights movement framed the integration of professional football, baseball, and basketball in 1950. The Black Power movement, which came out of the civil rights movement, framed the revolt of the black athlete that gave us black head coaches, athletic directors, and so forth. Title IX came out of the civil rights movement. It framed the women's movement that ultimately gave us not just the legitimacy of the Williams sisters and Billie Jean King and so forth, but Hillary Clinton as a legitimate candidate. Years before that, a woman running would have been seen pretty much as an African-American male running or a Latino male running, as a joke. Now, as a result of all of these things coming together, there's some legitimacy there. The 99%ers now demonstrating in front of financial institutions from Wall Street in New York to the plazas and Montgomery Street in San Francisco could provide this framing ingredient. One measure of the scope and depth of the 99%er political potential society-wide will be the extent to which the protest elements now loosely associated with the movement can form and focus around a central ideology and goal that ultimately penetrates the college campuses, where students across the country are already demonstrating against rising tuition, unconscionable administrative compensation, and course reductions that extend degree completion time. Should this movement penetrate the youth culture and collegiate environments to the extent that Black Power and Civil Rights movement did in the 1960s, or the integration movement did in the late 1940s and 50s, collegiate athletes will not be able to avoid its direct impact. In the mid and late 1960s, our protest movement in sports differed substantially from the struggles waged by Jackie Robinson and others of his era. Commensurately, a protest movement among college athletes today would differ substantially from the movement we mounted. Under the circumstances, the collegiate sports establishment might well come to be the target of a reconstituted version of a call already well established in the popular mind as the athlete's principal focus and motivating passion in modern sports. The slogan of these times could well be, "Show me the money." If the NC2A does not get ahead of the curve in leading change efforts relative to the content and configuration of potential and already emergent economic developments in the collegiate sports enterprise within the next 5 to 8 years, this century-old august regulatory body could well become all but utterly irrelevant in the affairs of big-time collegiate athletics, assuming that it continues to exist as a functioning regulatory body at all. So what we are looking at here is another one of those historical moments, like the period coming out of World War II, like the period of the 1960s, where there was, as this author says, something in the air. And it is going to result in a substantial change in collegiate athletics, just as post-World War II resulted in integration. The movement of the 1960s resulted in advances in women's sports, African Americans and other minorities in leadership and authority positions. But now we're talking about how are the economics of this free enterprise business going to be configured going forward. And I think that what we're looking at with this movement is the context within which that will ultimately be conceptualized. Now, people say, well, geez, you know, the Occupy movement is all over the place. They don't have any leaders. They don't have, hey, if you go back to the 1950s, the emerging civil rights movement was all over the place. In the 1960s, it was all over the place. I know Dr. King is the face of the movement. Looking back, well, Dr. King and the civil rights movement. Hey, that was Whitney Young. There was A. Philip Randolph. There was Roy Wilkins. There was H. Rap Brown. There was Stokely Carmichael. There was Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. There was Angela Davis. There was the Congress of Racial Equality under James Forman. You know, I mean, it was all over the place. And that's not even to speak of Cesar Chavez and what he had going. And Gloria Steinem and what she had going. This thing was all over the place. And so to look out now and see the Occupy movement all over the place is no reason for discouragement. That's reason for encouragement, because somewhere in that you're going to find a coalescence coming. And in terms of sport, this is where I think it's headed. The other reality that you have to look at, people go, well, where is the leader? Where is the leadership? Where was the leadership in the 1950s? Where was the leadership in the 1960s? Most of the time, you don't see these people coming because they are created out of the heat of the movement. Nobody sees them coming. Nobody saw Dr. King coming. Dr. King was a 26-year-old minister down in Montgomery, Birmingham. Nobody saw Malcolm X coming. He was a 26-year-old convict. Nobody saw Huey Newton coming. He was over here at Merritt College, junior college, he and Bobby Seale. Nobody saw Ralph coming. I mean, if I had seen him coming, I'd say, man, what you doing in this neighborhood? You know? Nobody saw the revolt of the black athlete coming. In all likelihood, somebody who stands up and presents themselves as a leader of the Occupy movement is not the leader. We don't see them coming. But I guarantee you one thing, just as in every era in the past, although we won't see them coming, we will recognize her when she gets here and defines things and says, this is the way that we need to go. So you want to understand collegiate athletics within the institutional context that it stands in relationship to the rest of society. Anyway, I hope that you found something in this of interest. Thank you.
So much. We have time for just a few.
Just about one or two, I think. Looks like. Any questions? Yes.
I have a question.
Yes.
You described the plantation model using college athletes to make profits for the people who control the games. You described that very well. And you said in wrapping up that you think that we're going to move toward a model where college athletes are going to have to be compensated in some way for the profit that they produce. Now, what if that doesn't happen? Because I see another trend existing, which is college athletes get a whole lot of resources at universities, like at this university. In fact, in this class we've talked about all the different ways that the university helps them and gives them subsidies that other students don't get. What if there's pushback like that where, in fact, the athletes are getting less? Do you think it's possible that we might see the beginning of a separation from college football from the universities? Or do you think, as you did state a number of times, that this is impossible?
Well, I think first of all, what athletes get is oftentimes a lot more geared toward the needs of the athletic department than it is toward the needs of the athlete. A lot of what athletes put up with is predicated on this notion that one day they're going to, and I'm not talking about the people in water polo or tennis or badminton and swimming. You know, I'm talking about basketball players and football players, revenue-producing sports. I'm not even talking about baseball. Is predicated on this notion that one day they're going to sign a professional contract, when in point of fact less than 2% of the athletes who play collegiate football and who are eligible in any given year end up on a roster. I do interviews at the Combine every year for the 49ers and have been since 1985, and I can look at an athlete when he comes in and see his hopes are way up there and everything. His chances of making a football team are about the same as my chances of flying the shuttle, which is not even flying anymore. So at the end of it all, there's a lot more on paper than there is in fact. The other point that I would make is this, that this thing is splitting into these super conferences. We're not talking San Jose State here. We may not even be talking Boise State. We're talking these 4 to 6 super conferences that are going to emerge around basketball and football. And at that point, something is going to have to give as far as compensating these athletes are concerned. When you have coaches who are making $6 and $7 million a year, when you have departments with budgets in excess of $150 million, while they're telling the athlete, we give you an ethical opportunity to achieve an education in exchange for your athletic participation, and then they find out that there are majors they can't even major in because they have labs, and that covers that's so when you break it down, yeah, a lot of money is spent on athletes, but toward what end? Most of it is in the interest of the athletic departments. I mean, that's just a straight up, honest appraisal. Do I see an option to eventually allowing agents to represent athletes, and once it starts, somebody is going to find an athlete at San Jose State or 4 or 5 athletes at Boise State, even though their main clientele is at Ohio State or Michigan or wherever. I really don't see an option going forward, especially if this movement that's sweeping this country, and by the way, is not going to go away, takes hold and has the same impact that history tells us other broad-scale movements have had in sports.
One last question.
So, do you think the whole idea of the Occupy movement and the anti-corporate ideas will they'll naturally get reflected in the sports industry and the whole idea of the sports way?
These movements, the Occupy movement, when you break it down, are not anti-corporate. They're anti-greed. They're anti-swinishness. And so when you adjust that problem, the one thing that bothers me about the Occupy movement is this, and this is one that I'm still wrestling with. What provoked people to get in the street was not what we have seen, at least since the early 1980s, in our urban centers. It has not been the deterioration of athletes, just like what has provoked faculty and students on these major campuses to start being concerned about the amount of money being siphoned off by athletics is not what was happening in the plantation system of athletic organization, especially as it impacted black athletes. It's when all of a sudden they look up and the chemistry department isn't getting this money, the humanities section isn't getting their money, the student tuition is going up, their fees are going up. That's what moved these students to rebellion. And the same with the Occupy people. It wasn't the urban centers, it wasn't what was happening in the barrios. That economic situation that they're suffering out in Concord now, in Lafayette and Walnut Creek, has been ongoing in the urban centers since the early 1980s. But that wasn't what spurred the Occupy movement. It's when they found themselves out of house, out of work, and out of gas, Now all of a sudden, and what I'm afraid of is that they are going to come around with a solution that is not all-inclusive. So this thing is not anti-corporation and anti-banks. It's anti-swinishness. It's anti-greed. And if they can get that resolved and get more sharing of the wealth with those people who are out there in those encampments, justifiably so, I think that problem will be resolved. All I'm saying is that let's share the wealth as well with the athletes who are producing it.
Thank you very much again.